Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of True Crime and Whatnot. Today we're going to talk about a very interesting case from the 1950s. It has a lot of similar aspects to Bonnie and Clyde, which I found to be really, really interesting. This case has been depicted in several songs and movies as well as television, which is another reason why I thought it would be interesting. My mother actually recommended this one to me, and I had forgotten all about it. So let's jump right into the Starkweather Fugate case, shall we? Warning. The following story depicts accounts of violence, sexual assault, and animal cruelty. Viewer discretion is advised. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born November 24th, 1938 in Lancaster, Nebraska. He was the third child of Guy and Helen Starkweather. Charles was born with genoverum, which is the medical term for being bow-legged or bow-legged. He also had a speech impediment, and because of both of those abnormalities, as they would have been considered at that time, he was teased and bullied a lot in school, but he excelled at gym class, and ultimately he became the bully when he was in high school. By 1956, he dropped out of high school during his senior year, and then shortly after, he met 13-year-old Carol Ann Fugate through her sister Barbara. Barbara was dating his friend Bob Von Bush at the time, and he got a job at a newspaper warehouse that was near her school, and he would start to visit her every day after school. Now, I don't know if his visits were at the school or if he would walk her home. It wasn't really specified. I'm going to say he was probably visiting her at the school. That seems like the most likely situation there. So, Carol Ann Fugate was born July 30th, 1943 in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I couldn't really find much regarding her background other than she lived in Lincoln with Velda and Marion Bartlett, as well as her half-sister Betty Jean. Now, Marion and Velda were her mother and stepfather as well. Charles taught Carol how to drive, and one day while they were driving his dad's car, she wrecked it, and his father, Guy, banished him from the family home. Now, at this point, according to many accounts from family and friends, the Starkweathers were terrified of their son, and the car accident was the last straw. So, I couldn't find any proof or any first-hand accounts of why his family was afraid of him. But I can tell you by looking at his pictures that he really was not a small guy. He was pretty buff, and he looked pretty strong. So that probably played a big role in his ability to scare people. So at this point, his father's kicked him out, and he quits his job at the newspaper factory and becomes a garbage collector. At this point in his life, he's 19 years old, and he is just a very cold person, and he has a complete disregard for human life. And that is so very sad when you consider how young he was. On November 30th, 1957, at 19 years old, Charles entered a service station and asked to buy a stuffed toy on credit. The young man that was running the station at the time was 21-year-old Robert Colvert, and Robert refused to sell him the toy on credit, which really made Charles angry. And Charles came back several times throughout the evening, trying to get Robert to change his mind. The last time he showed up, he came with shotgun in hand. He forced young Robert to give him $100 from the register, as well as the stuffed toy, and then he drove Robert to a remote area where they fought, and Charles ultimately killed him with several shots. And this was Charles's first murder. He was 19 years old. 19. That's crazy. On January 21st, 1958, Charles went to Carol's home, where her mother and stepfather expressed their desire for him to just stay away from her. And you need to understand, she's 14 at this point, and in the state of Nebraska, then and now, age of consent is 16. She's 14, he's 19. This is not happening. They're not going to have it happen. So he shoots them, both of them. And then unfortunately, clubs 2-year-old Betty Jean to death because she cried. He hid the bodies in the buildings behind the house. Now, I don't want to get into great detail regarding Betty Jean's murder, just because the nature of it, and it involves a toddler, and I'm a mom of a toddler myself, and that's traumatic to think of, and I just don't want, I don't want to give anyone that visual. But I can tell you, his choice of hiding spots for Velda and Marion speak volumes for his feelings and level of hatred toward them both. He shot her stepfather in the chicken coop, and that's where he left him. But her mother, well, he moved her body to the outhouse. And for those of you that may be too young to know exactly what an outhouse was, it was the toilet, the bathroom. He moved her body to the outdoor bathroom because they probably didn't have indoor plumbing in the house at that point in time. Indoor plumbing is an amenity that was not fully acted upon until sometime in the 1980s, where every house had to have it, where it was a necessity. At this point in time, these people didn't have that. And I'm assuming they didn't have it because they still had the outhouse. A lot of times they would just, tear the building down and then cover the hole up with dirt. And since they still had it, I'm gonna say it was probably still active. But I digress. So now we get into the same thing you get into with almost any crime scene that involves more than one assailant. This is where all the he said, she said is going to start. Charles stated that Carol had been present the entire time while he killed her family, while she maintains that he met her with a gun and told her as long as she cooperated, her family would be safe. I don't know that could be the case, just because they stayed in the house for several days until her grandmother let the police know on January 27th, 1958, that there was something hinky going on. So they leave. They stayed for 7 days in the house. And then 7 days later, after the police had been alerted, they drove to a farmhouse owned by 70-year-old August Meyer, who was a family friend of the Bartletts and lived in nearby Bennett, Nebraska. Charles shot him in the head and then killed his dog. Why do people have to hurt the animals? That's one thing I don't think I'll ever fully understand, is why do you have to hurt an animal? I'm an animal lover. I love my cat. You'll hear him every now and then rustling papers, and I just can't. I cannot fathom hurting animals, and I can't wrap my mind around that, and I can't wrap my mind around hurting a child. Those are two things that I just feel should be untouched. But anyway, getting off topic. As they were leaving the area of Mr. Meyer's home, their car got stuck in the mud, so they just abandoned it. And that's when they ran into teenage couple Robert Jensen and Carol King, and they stopped to give them a ride. Charles then forced them to drive to an abandoned storm cellar in Bennett. He then shot Robert, who was 17, in the back of the head. He attempted to rape Carol, who was 16, but he couldn't perform, and he got very angry and shot her dead as well. Now again, he said Carol actually killed Carol, but she states she stayed in the car the entire time. So again, he said, she said. And again, this is just like with Bonnie and Clyde. We will never know the true story. We'll know her side, we'll know his side, but we won't know that gray line. And that gray line is where the truth is. So they then drove Robert's car to a wealthy area of Lincoln, Nebraska, where they entered the home of C. Lauer Ward and his wife Clara. And once inside, they stabbed the Ward's maid, Lumila, and they called her Lillian Vinci, to death. And as they waited for the Wards to come home, Charles once again killed the family dog to keep him from barking and alerting them. And then Mrs. Ward came home first and was stabbed to death. And then as soon as Mr. Ward walked in the house, he was shot in the head. Charles and Carol then filled Ward's black 1956 Packard with jewelry and, I'm assuming, other valuables from the home, although jewelry would be the easiest thing to grab and just take. They left Nebraska at that time. Now, due to the fact that the latest victims were very wealthy, and as it would turn out, close friends of the governor, the police department then enforced house-to-house searches. The governor activated the Nebraska National Guard, and the Lincoln police chief called for block-by-block searches. That's right, folks. Privilege has always been alive and well. We just tend to forget our history and love of money. Money does brilliant things sometimes. Well, at this point, Charles and Carol are already out of Nebraska, and they stumbled upon a sleeping traveling salesman in his Buick along the highway outside Douglas, Wyoming. After waking Merle Collison, Charles shoots and kills him. And unfortunately for Charles, this Buick had something he wasn't quite familiar with: a parking brake. As he tried to leave the scene, the car stalled because the brake was still engaged. He attempted to restart the car, and a local geologist named Joe Sprinkle stopped to help him. Charles then threatened him with a rifle, and they started to fight. And at this time, Natrona County Sheriff Deputy William Romer was driving by. Carol ran up to him, supposedly yelling, "It's Starkweather, he's gonna kill me." Charles then drove off and was chased by Deputy Romer, Douglas Police Chief Robert Ansley, and Converse County Sheriff Earl Heflin. Speeds in this chase exceeded well over 100 miles an hour, and that had to be just unheard of for the 50s, because they didn't have vehicles that had a Hemi in them. So they were pushing these vehicles to get every ounce of energy out of them. So Sheriff Heflin shot the car, and he shattered the windshield. The glass hits Charles and cuts him deep enough to make him bleed. He surrendered near Douglas, Wyoming on January 29th, 1958. Sheriff Heflin said, and I'm paraphrasing here because he used some curse words, and I didn't want to do that. But he is quoted as saying he thought he was bleeding to death. That's the reason he stopped. That's the kind of coward he is. Again, I paraphrased. Charles chose to be extradited back to Nebraska because he thought both states would execute him. But at the time, the governor of Wyoming, Millward Simpson, opposed the death penalty. Now, it is rumored that Governor Simpson actually wanted to go for the death penalty in this case. So, whether or not that's true, I'm not entirely sure. I only found one story where that was stated. So, in his original statement, Charles said that he had kidnapped Carol and she had nothing to do with any of the murders. But he changed his tune during her trial. And he did testify at Carol Ann's trial, stating she was involved during the entire situation. Now, Carol always said she was a hostage, and to this day, she still maintains that she didn't know about her family's deaths. The judge didn't view her as a hostage or a victim, stating she had several opportunities to get away, and she just didn't try. Charles stated he believed he was supposed to die, and if he was executed, he thought Carol Ann should be too. Now, I think he had the mindset of, in death, they were not going to be separated. They were going to be together, whether people liked it or not. Altogether, Charles was only tried and convicted for one murder, and that was the murder of Robert Jensen, the 17-year-old, the one who stopped to help him. On May 23rd, 1958, not even a year after all of this began, he was sentenced to the death penalty. And on June 24th, 1959, at 12:04 a.m., Charles Starkweather was executed by electric chair. He was the last person to be executed in Nebraska until 1994, when Harold Lamont Odie was executed for murder. 30 minutes before Charles was due to be executed, the doctor that was supposed to pronounce him dead died of a heart attack, which is just kind of odd and eerie and weird, don't you think? Charles Starkweather gave no last words, but he did send a letter from prison to his parents, and he wrote, "But Dad, I'm not real sorry for what I did, 'cause for the first time, me and Carol have more fun." Guys, he accepted his fate, and he didn't care. Charles was buried, and I hope I'm saying this correctly, Wyuka Cemetery in Lincoln, Nebraska. And this is the same cemetery as 5 of his victims, including C. Lauer Ward and Clara Ward. At the time of his execution, he was 20 years old. Now, as for Carol Ann was the youngest female in U.S. history to be tried and convicted of first-degree murder. She was 14. In 1973, the Nebraska Board of Pardons commuted her sentence to 30 to 50 years, and this would make her eligible for parole. She was a model prisoner, and on June 20th, 1976, she was paroled. She spent nearly 18 years in prison. After her release, she moved to Michigan, where she married Frederick Clare in 2007. On August 5th, 2013, Carol and her husband were driving their SUV when it went off the road and flipped. Carol was seriously injured, but unfortunately, her husband died at the scene of the accident. In February 2020, Carol Ann Clare was denied a full pardon due to her request being too broad. I've really went back and forth over the death penalty and just this case in general. And this is not a subject that I take lightly. My own personal thoughts are, I believe there are specifics that are looked at and should definitely be considered before the death penalty even becomes a discussion. Do I feel it was the right thing here? Yes. Why? Because he did not have any remorse. All he cared about was that he and Carol die together. He never apologized to any of the families. He didn't even apologize to Carol. And I think, in the least, she did deserve that. I don't think he could be rehabilitated. He was a lost boy. And his killing spree was, for lack of a better definition, a little boy throwing a tantrum because people wouldn't give him his way. I mean, look at the people he killed. He killed Robert because Robert wouldn't give him a stuffed toy on credit. He killed Carol's family because they didn't want him to have anything to do with her. It just... he was throwing a tantrum. Now, as for Carol, I do believe she got a fair sentence, and I hope she was able to turn her life around, and it really sounds like she was. As far as I know, she never had any more issues with the law. She was young enough to be rehabilitated, and she became just a normal person. And that's the point of rehabilitation. Can you take someone who's able to have that mind flip into what is acceptable in society. And I think she was young enough, because she was just a child. She really was. She was so young, and she was a victim. She wasn't a victim in the general sense that she was the hostage, but I do believe she was too young to have really understood what was going on to the full extent. And she was too young to be involved with this young man. If she had been 16, 17 years old, it wouldn't have been as big a deal. I appreciate you letting me ramble my thoughts out about all of this, because as I was doing this research, the whole time I just kept coming back to that poor girl, and just how lost she probably felt toward the end. This was only like a month long. They didn't go on the run for years like Bonnie and Clyde. This was just 1 month. And they had almost the exact same death toll as Bonnie and Clyde. Can you imagine if Charles Starkweather was able to actually run and get away in Wyoming? It's crazy. Crazy the amount of people he could have killed. But thanks for joining me for True Crime and Whatnot. And I will have a new case or story for you very soon. Until then, stay true and whatnot. Bye.